السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll go through the hadith number 32 from the 40 hadith of Imam An-Nawawi rahimahullah. And this hadith is one of the hadith, like all of the hadith in the 40 hadith, is a foundation and a principle to many other rulings in the deen of Islam, mainly in the subject of al-fiqh, especially with the rulings that deals with the rights of others, transactions and the rights of others and things of that nature. And in this hadith is always an evidence to many of these rulings. And it's also a foundation for many of the ijtihad of the ulama with regards to new matters that involves harming others or protecting oneself from harm. And we have to always make sure that whenever we learn some of these hadith and these foundations of the deen, that we don't rush into making our own judgments or our own ijtihad, regardless of the other matters of knowledge of the deen. And we should refer always to the people of ilm, to the ulama, and to have good expectations of them and good thinking about the people of knowledge. And that the issue of a dalil or the evidence is not just a specific evidence to a specific ruling, but there are major evidences that brings major principles and foundations in the deen that cannot be contradicted. So this hadith is one of them. So what I'm trying to say is there are more evidence to a matter than just the specific evidence that is related to the subject that a person is speaking about. And we'll talk about examples, inshallah ta'ala. So let's first see what the hadith says. The hadith is basically just two words, and it brings these great benefits, as the Prophet ﷺ said. As you see, the hadith says عن أبي سعيد سعد بن مالك بن سنان الخدري رضي الله عنه. That's the narrator of the hadith. أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال, that the Prophet ﷺ said, لا ضرر ولا ضرار. لا ضرر, no ضرر, no harm, ولا ضرار. And we'll talk about the difference between the two words, but the two words, they look like they are the same. Darar is harm. Darar is harm too. Whether it is not permissible to harm someone, and it's not permissible to be harmed. And also, the la here refers to the darar or the harm to be removed. That's one of the principles of the deen, that harm is to be removed. The Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came to push away harm and to bring benefit to the people. And this is again one of the basic foundations of matters of deen and rulings. But let's first it says here the hadith on Hasan, Rawah ibn Majah wa Musnadan. So it's a sound hadith. First of all, what is the difference between the two words, or the two la darar wa la darar? La means no. So and no mean here that it's not permissible, and it's something that also to be prevented, to be pushed away, to be removed, with the other foundations and principles of deen, of course. Some of the ulama, they said that ad-darar here, what is mentioned in the hadith, is the name. No darar, no harm. What darar is al-fi'l, is the action. That means no harm is valid, no harm is good, and no dirar, that means do not do act of harming others. So that means ad-darar, the harm in itself, does not exist in the Shara, does not exist in the deen of Islam, does not exist in the rulings from Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not ordain upon the people something in the deen that would cause them harm. And also something that people might, something come up, for example, that has harm in it. Part of the objectives of the deen is to push away the harm, is to remove the harm. So this is when it comes to the meaning of the name. And the action is to when it comes to the action of the person or the individual or anyone that do not bring harm to others. The action of the harm itself is also to be removed when it comes to the actions of the people. So this is one of the meanings of the hadith. That means harm is not present in the rulings in the deen of Islam. And no dirar, that means do not do harm. And when it comes to actions, harm also is to be removed. Also, another meaning to the hadith, that ad-darar, la darar, it means do not harm others. Right? That you would benefit yourself by something by causing harm to others. And we'll talk about some of the examples, inshallah. But these are important principles, if it's correct to say, that a person might benefit by something, but in the context of benefiting, he would harm others. Then that's not permissible. So when the selfishness of individuals, or so that as long as they benefit, it doesn't matter to them if it causes harm to others or not. This is one of the criteria to know that this is haram. To do something that is benefiting that would cause harm to others. And when the harm or to harm others can be permissible, or to harm oneself, if it's something that is inevitable. That means you are either going to do one harm or the other. There's no other choice but to cause harm than to choose the lesser harm. Right? So it sounds like it's a complicated thing, and that's why it needs lots of knowledge and knowing the objectives of the Sharia and the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But let's first, we're going one after another with meanings here that it's important to understand before we get into the examples, inshallah. So it is darar here. The second meaning is that a person would cause harm to others while he's benefiting. And ad-darar, which is the second word, is that he would cause harm to others without benefiting himself with it. So this is another meaning. So that he will cause harm to others while he benefits, that's darar. And darar is when he causes harm to others and he does not benefit. And this is also a meaning that some of the ulama, they talked about or they mentioned. And they're all correct meaning. Also, a third meaning to it, that ad-darar, la darar, the first one, is that he would harm the one that does not harm him. It is not permissible to harm someone that doesn't harm you. Someone that did not harm you, did not cause any harm, and then you would try to harm him, that of course is obviously is not permissible. So la darar. And ad-darar, which is the second one, to harm someone that harmed you. That's also not permissible. Because some people, they justify for themselves to harm others because they have been harmed. That's not permissible, unless it's in the way to establish justice by the people of authority. Because the punishment of a criminal, that can be looked at as a harmful thing. A criminal would see this, that this is harm being afflicted upon him. But that's a valid harm, because it's part of the deen of Islam. And it's part of the justice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered. But who has the right to do so? How it's to be implemented? This is also according to the rulings of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are all correct meanings of la darar wa la dirar. All of that is valid in the meaning of this hadith. So here, as you see, that the Prophet ﷺ is either denying that there is any harm or any harm to be in the deen of Islam, or to be afflicted by others without the right to do so, because this is basically going over the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or to forbid any means of harm that a person would commit, whether it's benefiting for himself or not. There are many examples of the darar, or the harm that people can afflict upon others, and it's basically it's something that is mentioned in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of which that ad-darar, or harm in the wasiyah. And this is an example that always comes up. Al-wasiyah, when a person has a will, and to harm those who would benefit from the wasiyah, or those who are supposed to benefit from the wasiyah, this is one of the major sins. And there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when someone talked about its authenticity, that إن العبد لا يعمل بطاعة الله, that a person would do the acts of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala 60 سنة, for 60 years. ثم يحضره الموت, then death comes to him, فيضار في الوصية, then he would harm in the وصية, in the will, فيدخل النار, he would enter then the hellfire. And there's the ayah in the Quran, من بعد وصية يوصى بها أو دين غير مضار, that in the verses that talked about the laws of inheritance, after a wasiyah, after a will, that he would, or request that he would have, or debt غير مضار, without causing any harm. And Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, he said when he explained this verse, that al-idrar fi al-wasiyah min al-kabair, to harm in the wasiyah, in the will, it's from the major sin. How can a person harm in the wasiyah? Is that when he would deprive one of his heirs, for example, from inheriting that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it for them, especially when people are living in the West, when there's no laws of inheritance to be applied. So it's up to the person when he's writing his will. So he would, for example, he doesn't like his wife or his children, whatever there is, and he would deprive them from the portion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them in matters of inheritance. And this is, of course, not permissible. This is part of what the hadith says. And the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَعْطَى كُلَّ ذِي حَقٍّ حَقَّهُ فَلَا وَصِيَّةَ لِوَارِثٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave each one his rights. So there's no wasiyah to warith. There's no wasiyah to heir. That means those who would inherit from you, as those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, you don't write anything in the wasiyah, in the portion of the 1/3 of one's wealth, up to 1/3 of one's wealth, where he can write up to 1/3 whatever he wants to, whatever he wish. The rest of his wealth is to be distributed according to the laws of inheritance. So when someone intentionally try to harm, like a person, for example, in his deathbed, he would divorce his wife so that she does not inherit. And this is a situation that happens often in many of situations where a man, for example, married other than his wife, the mother of his children. It says, and the children are around him, and they want to deprive their stepmother from inheritance, for example. So they would convince their father while he is in his deathbed, and because of how much he cares for his children, to divorce her, for example. That divorce is not to be considered valid if it's in his deathbed, because it was for the intention of causing harm to her, which is another implication to that hadith, to that ruling. So if it becomes clear, with clear evidence, that a person was trying to cause harm, then he is to be treated opposite to his intentions. So if he's intended to divorce to harm his wife in his deathbed so that she does not inherit, then the divorce is not valid. And the judge would rule that it's not valid, therefore she inherits. And this is the case with anything that a person intended to harm, is to be treated opposite to what his intentions is. And also, one of the very clear examples that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the word dirar in the Quran is with regards to what they used to do in Jahiliyyah. In Jahiliyyah, they used to, if a man hates his wife or doesn't like his wife or want to punish his wife, he would divorce her. And then before the iddah, before the waiting period finishes, he takes her back. And then takes her back, and he does not give her any rights. And then he divorces her again. And then before the waiting period finishes, he takes her back. So she's not married really, and she's not divorced. And he would keep on doing this as a way to abuse his wife. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, فَأَمْسِكُوهُنَّ بِمَعْرُوفٍ أَوْ سَرِّحُوهُنَّ بِمَعْرُوفٍ. Either you keep them with ma'roof, with goodness, or you let them go with ma'roof, with goodness. وَلَا تُمْسِكُوهُنَّ ضِرَارًا لِتَعْتَدُوا. And do not keep them ضِرَارًا, to harm them, which is also a general ruling. Someone that doesn't want to divorce his wife, to harm her. Not that he wants goodness as a result of not wanting to divorcing her, but he wants to cause harm to her. And that's, people in dispute, they do that. A husband would say, I'm not going to divorce. And he would keep her like this, not really married and not really divorced. And I've seen cases where people for tens of years, the man is in one country, the woman is another country, and he refused to divorce. and the people think that there's no way out of this, and she just become, in that state of being harmed. In which, of course, if someone is like that, is the judge is to enforce the divorce. And why? Because the Prophet ﷺ said, "La darara wa la dirar." There is no harm in the deen of Islam and the rulings of the Sharia. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the right to the husband to divorce, it doesn't mean that he can use that to harm his wife. So since the harm is to be pushed away, then once it becomes clear that he is harming his wife, not fulfilling the rights of being a husband and so on, then لا ضرر ولا ضرار. So this is a very important foundation and a principle in the deen of Islam, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the talaq 3 times and all the different rulings of the talaq. Also the subject of al-ila, but we don't want to get into the details of that also, that if they used to do that in Jahiliyyah, that the man would swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he would not approach his wife, or that his wife becomes like his mother, forbidding his wife upon himself to cause harm to her. And that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it, if someone does this, that he is given the period of 4 months. And after that, either they are back together, or the divorce becomes enforced because of the harm that is afflicted. The same thing with the rights of others, the rights of the child to be fostered and to be breastfed, and not to harm the child, especially when there's a divorce or the like of this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned it in the Quran. لا تضار والدة بولدها ولا مولود له بولده. That the mother is not to be harmed by her son, and vice versa, especially when the husband would refuse, if they're divorced, he would refuse to support his child when the mother needs to breastfeed him also. That means he should not prevent the mother of the child from breastfeeding her child, and things like this. So this is also a subject in the relationship between the husband and the wife, in the subject of raising children, in which again no harm is to be afflicted, and there's no rulings in the deen of Islam. Some people, they use some of the rights or some of the rulings in the deen of Islam with the lack of knowledge to make harm to others. That's not the deen of Islam. That's not part of the Sharia, because the Prophet ﷺ said, "La darara wa la dirar," or the physical harm or non-physical harm that people would do, regardless of the rulings of the deen of Islam. The same thing when, in transactions and buying and selling, there are things that many applications to this. When people would, the Prophet ﷺ, for example, نهى عن بيع المضطر, he forbade the person from selling when he's a necessity. You know that your brother is selling his house because he's bankrupted, or he's going to live in the streets, for example, right? So he needs to sell it right away because he's in a form of a dire need or a necessity. So if the house is worth 100,000, he wants to sell it. Even if he gets 10,000, he would sell it. So a person will come forward and purchase it with 10,000, and he think that it's valid, it's halal, he was agreeing to it, he's pleased with it, and that's not really permissible. But again, what is the criteria to know that this is, where is the muttar here, where the necessity is? This is something also to be different from one situation to the other. But I'm giving that extreme example because a person might fall into this category, so it's not permissible when someone to use the need of others, basically. And that's why many of the forbidden transactions is because it's using the need of the people, and it causes harm, and basically disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala causes harm, of course. The relationship with the neighbors, anything, and that's not something that has to be with a specific evidence at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Things can come up with the different lifestyle that people have. So anything that will cause harm to the neighbor, then the hadith applies. La darara wa la dirar. So a person should not prevent his neighbor from doing something in his home, and a neighbor should not abuse the fact that sometimes neighbors, they share the same wall. So what are the rights when it comes to that wall? As long as that doesn't harm anyone. Some people, they just don't want their neighbor to do anything, even if it doesn't harm them. That's not permissible. But if it's harmful, then this is not permissible. Like even the ulama mentioned, even raising up the building in a way that would prevent the sun to be, for his neighbor, that he would receive sun rays or, the sunlight. That's not permissible. The neighbor has the right to receive air and sun and things like this, which is a very sad situation, many of the rulings of that. But that's why the government and so on, they govern these matters so that they would prevent the harm. So to that extent, you'd find in the Sharia that the neighbor is not supposed to raise up his building in a way that he would expose the house of his neighbor, in a way that opening a window, in his part of his land, so that he can expose his neighbor, or to block the sun from his neighbor. These types of things, which basically back to this hadith, la darara wala dirar, or having the right and then abuse the right that a person has. And there are many also examples to this. Just because of the time, I want to keep it for a long time. But if this hadith is explained in many rulings of the Deen of Islam, we can have sessions. It's just by itself is many sessions to explain this and the applications of it, and you would find it clearly in many of the rulings in matters of fiqh, especially with matters of transactions and the like of that. With regards to the water and the running water, for example, and things of that nature. So this is part of the objectives of the Sharia, la darara wa la dirar, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not make it upon his people to cause harm to them whatsoever. ما جعل عليكم في الدين من حرج. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not make any haraj or any difficulty in matters of the religion. If a person is not able to fast, should he continue to fast and harm himself? No, of course not. It even becomes not permissible for him to do so. And there are ways out for him: expiation, feeding others, making up the days, things like this. A person is not able to stand in the salah, it will cause him harm, then it's not permissible for him to do so. Someone is not able to make sujood because he made a surgery in his eyes, then he is to lean forward to the best of his ability, according to what a Muslim doctor would say that this is valid for him to do. The same thing that we see clearly in these types of measures in pandemics and things like this. The ulama, they give the rulings based on this principle, la darara wa la dirar, as long as it's not something that is contradicting to matters of the deen. So that's why when we say we have to listen to the people of knowledge, for example, if they talk about wearing masks in the salah, or social distancing, or the things that these types of temporary rulings are in the masajid, we have to respect that, because it's not based on just a person of authority saying something, but it's based on principles in the Sharia that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, and the people of knowledge have these matters, and they make this type of ijtihad, and to make the matter easy for the people. And that's why we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the proper understanding, and to make us among those who are not harmed in this life or the hereafter. I will stop here because of the time, but again, the applications to this hadith are so many. And again, going back to the meaning of it from what's mentioned in the beginning helps to describe or to understand some of the rulings of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.